When we last left off, the characters were tracking troglodytes into an abandoned house, and they found a hatch that was inside of one of the supply closets. And they found out that the hatch led underneath a tunnel that led underneath the house. So they decided to investigate, jump down into the tunnel, and see where it led, see if they could track these troglodytes. As they were traveling into the tunnel, Dagon, the thief, discovered that a tripwire had been set, and it connected to a vial of alchemist fire that was hanging from the ceiling. So he took apart the trap and added one vial of alchemist fire to his inventory. In continuing down the tunnel, they found that there were two doors on the left-hand side that were locked, and then the tunnel continued into the darkness. The party members decided to investigate these doors to make sure nothing would jump out and attack them from behind. In one of the rooms, they found a cell that recently had an explosion that seemed to have blown apart most of the cell and the bench that was inside. There was soot and ash, tattered pieces of clothing, and they found a shoe with a dismembered foot inside of it. All the characters, hopeful that this foot did not belong to Hector, decided to continue investigating the other room. The thief successfully picked the lock, and they went inside and found that there were 3 treasure chests, but they were empty. However, in the middle treasure chest, underneath it, someone had hidden a pouch so that no one else would be able to find it but themselves. Inside the leather pouch was 50 gold and a silver brooch that was designed in the shape of a shield. As the characters were traveling down this tunnel, which what seemed to be a decent amount of time, they came across a large cavernous area made of stone, and they discovered a lot of stone coffins that were littered inside of this room. Stone coffins, sarcophagi inside of this room. The druid, deciding to sneak around and investigate a little bit more, turned into a squirrel once again and went forth into the darkness. He discovered that an ogre was chained at the far end of the room, and it was guarding what seemed to be some stairs that were leading upwards. The druid, calculating how much slack the ogre had on the chain, decided that he probably had enough to reach them if they entered into the room. However, at that moment, the ogre was actually asleep, so they had the element of surprise. The ranger decided to set up a bear trap just in case the ogre decided to rush them. And the thief gave the ranger his vial of alchemist fire so that the ranger could attach it to her bow or to her arrow, and she could shoot it and catch the ogre on fire. So the party decided to coordinate their attacks, and the ranger and druid pulled out their longbows, knocked them with arrows, while the warlock tiefling Mirren decided to ready an eldritch blast. All the while, the thief decided to go around a headstone and hide for an upcoming sneak attack. Then, in a coordinated effort, all 3 characters loosed their range attacks and hit the ogre. As the vial of alchemist fire exploded, it covered the back of the ogre on fire, which was doing extra damage every turn. The ogre, now very understandably pissed off for being woken up in this rude manner, decided to rush the characters. The ranger's bear trap that was set did catch onto the ogre's foot, but he's a large monstrosity, so he was able to push through and ram into the characters. Since all of them were in a very tight passageway, he grabbed his ton and, kind of like a chimney sheep, rammed the club inside of the passageway, knocking all 3 of them over. It actually did enough damage in order to knock the tiefling unconscious. And one of the things I do in my games is I roll the death saving throws for my characters. So when I rolled it, they had no idea how good the tiefling was. However, the druid, wearing this new brooch, discovered that his damage was protected somehow. He didn't receive any damage. The brooch seemed to absorb it. Then, coming from behind, the thief, brandishing his magic sword that was specifically designed to kill ogres, jumped in an acrobatic fashion, vaulting off of a headstone, landing on the back of the ogre and sinking his sword deep into the back shoulder blade. The druid ran over to the warlock and gave him a health potion, which brought him back up to 8 points. The thief's sneak attack was enough in order to drop the ogre down, and the warlock readied himself an eldritch blast, landing it straight at the ogre's face, exploding his head. Visceral brain and skull and just a lot of really nasty stuff started coming out in a wave of this tunnel, landing on top of the thief. Now that they dealt with the guard dog, they decided to investigate a little further, and they went up the stairs and found a large jade statue that weighed about 1,500 pounds. It was carved in the likeness of a large snake with the face of a woman. As they continued up the stairway, they entered into a room that had a lot of different pieces of armor on display. It looks like they had stumbled into an armory through the back door. The warlock, who didn't really have much armor, decided to pocket one of these pieces of armor for himself that was just his size. Continue on to the next room, they discovered a library, and in the middle, a large tome that talked about the triumph of Saint Isolde. Saint Isolde is the patron saint of agriculture in the city of Orlane, and the one that they usually pray to at the temple. So the characters realize that they're inside the temple right now. As they move forward into another room, they discover a newly developed torture room, which is very uncharacteristic of an agriculture temple. They start thinking to themselves, why does this land have very fertile ground? Is it possible that maybe they're killing and cutting up bodies and then putting them in as fertilizer? And then they start thinking, well, we ate a lot of the produce. Are we cannibals? However, these moral dilemmas had to be put on hold because as they walked into this room, a secret passageway opened up and 4 troglodytes came out and surprised them. So coming off of one encounter and jumping straight into another one, they were already kind of low on their hit points and spell slots. However, that didn't stop them. They immediately jumped into action and defended themselves. The troglodytes were able to catch the thief by surprise and jump on him and start hitting him for blunt damage to try and knock him out. All the while, the ranger was grappled by one of the troglodytes, pushed onto the table, and the troglodyte was readying an axe in order to cut off her head. The druid, thinking really fast, jumped onto the wall using spider climb and used thorn whip in order to wrap it around the troglodyte's head and pull him onto the torture table. The ranger, now free, grabbed some daggers and started filleting the fish. All the while, the warlock brandished his weapon, a morning star, and discovered that it had a gleeful desire to kill a new monster. So the entity that had given him this morning star started rewarding him for defeating this troglodyte. He used the new power and bashed in the troglodyte's skull. The thief that was held down and restrained by one of the troglodytes lifted up his fingers and pushed it into the eye sockets of the trog, blinding him. The last trog that realized that he was probably in danger decided to escape, and he ran into the next room. The other 3 heroes, now composed, went over and helped the thief by defeating the other troglodyte on top of him. At this point, the characters are thinking that maybe we should rest because we're low on health and spell slots. But they realize that the troglodyte that left probably is getting reinforcements and they don't want to be caught unaware. So they decided to give chase. And they entered into the room and they discovered that this room had a lot of different scrawlings on the wall. It was very unkept. Different obscure texts were written, things like "the crocodile has many teeth" or "snake mother" were written on the ceiling. As they got to the end of the tunnel, they discovered that it was a dead end. The thief, realizing that there's probably a hidden passage here, investigated and was able to find a stone that was out of place. As he opened it up very carefully, they discovered another room. And this room had a cell with an individual who was tied up with a burlap sack over his head and he was missing a leg. They also discovered the troglodyte that had run away is now talking with what seems to be a human cloaked in a hood. Wanting to get a surprise attack, the druid and the thief decide to use a coordinated effort in order to do a pretty awesome acrobatic attack. Because the druid still has spider climb, he climbed onto the ceiling and used his hands kind of like a trapeze artist in order to grab onto the thief and vault him over so he could do a death from above attack on the troglodyte. And it worked. He was able to surprise him, land down with his sword hard onto the trog's back. At this point, the cloaked human figure turned around, saw the party, and decided to grab onto a glass vial, throw it onto the ground, and called forth 3 crocodiles from a mist. Low HP, low spell slots, and with one character had already gotten unconscious, the players decided that this was going to be a life and death encounter. The cloaked human figure raised his hand and whispered something into the mind of the warlock, and the warlock had to do a wisdom saving throw. He passed, but he realized that something was trying to charm him and turn him against his compatriots. The troglodyte was able to grab the druid off of the ceiling and throw him down onto the ground, and one of the crocodiles scuttled over, grabbed onto the leg of the ranger, bit it, and brought her down, making her unconscious. The cloaked figure, failing the first time, reached over to the thief and used the same spell on him. This time it worked. A large iron crown showed up on the thief's head, and his eyes turned blood red. The cloaked figure whispered 2 words, "Kill them." And the thief, now turned against his compatriots, attacked the warlock. The warlock was able to defend, and the thief was able to break out of the spell. And this time, it was personal. The thief used his entire action to dash over to the cloaked figure. Realizing that he was probably in trouble at this point, the cloaked figure reached over to the wall and activated a switch which opened up another safety hatch. And trying to get away as fast as he can, he polymorphed into a bat so he could fly away. However, the thief, using his cunning action, grabbed the bat out of the air and thrusted him into the mouth of a crocodile. So at this point, I've got my big bad guy who is turned into a bat, so he has low armor class. He's been grappled by the thief and thrusted into the mouth of a crocodile. Only in D&D. The cloaked figure, realizing that he doesn't have any other chance, canceled his polymorph, and so he exploded the crocodile from the inside as he turned back into a human. As the cloaked figure was readying to run, the warlock came over and tried to use another Eldritch Blast in order to incapacitate him. However, the cloaked figure raised his hand up and created an ethereal shield in order to stop the blast in its tracks. However, the warlock was able to jump on top of the cloaked figure, restrain him using a full Nelson, and the druid character was able to grab some rope and tie him up. The druid was able to use Healing Word onto the ranger and bring her back up to 6 HP, and she was able to finish off the last crocodile, so now they were out of combat. The druid and warlock, trying to intimidate the character, were asking him who he was so they could figure out what was going on in this temple. However, the hooded figure was not intimidated and laughed at all of their attempts. The thief, going over to the cell, opened it up with the keys from the hooded figure, and it realized that the individual that was in the cell as he took off the burlap sack was not Hector Alarosa. This was actually an elf that was called from the mayor in order to investigate what was happening in this town, but had gotten restrained by the cult. The thief also realized another piece of information. The elf had a collar that was wrapped around his neck that was made out of a strange metal. It had 2 locks on it and 4 different pouches hanging from it, which seemed to have fuses connected to them. The elf warned the thief that if he left that cell, he was told he would die. The other characters, realizing they weren't getting any information from the bad guy, knocked him unconscious so that they could question him later on. And now the other characters joining the thief realize they have a very real bomb threat on their hands. Thinking about everything that they can do, they decided to pour water onto the pouches to see if maybe they could dampen the gunpowder. However, the pouches demonstrated that they actually had oil on them, which seemed to negate the water. So the player who plays the druid character got really excited all of a sudden and started looking on his phone, and then he exclaimed, "Alcohol cancels out oil!" And so he poured the wine onto the oil. Up until now, the druid had failed almost all of his ability checks, so it was very cool for him to have this moment of figuring out how to deal with the oil. Doing everything they could to assist the thief, they decided the rest is in the thief's hands. As the thief started picking the locks, he realized the metal of the collar and the locks were made of flint. So any wrong move using his iron thieving tools would explode everyone. For this particular skill check, he had to get best 2 out of 3 in order to make sure that he was able to defuse the bomb. Rolling his first check, he got a 16, which was just enough to pull off one of the locks. But then the elf with the collar started jittering uncontrollably out of fear. The druid, thinking very quickly, gave him his ring of animal friendship, which seemed to calm him, bringing him back to a seamlessly sense of tranquility of being close to nature. The warlock tried to assist the best he could by using a sponge to wipe off the sweat of the thief, similar to a surgeon in the middle of surgery. The next DC that the thief had to beat was a 15. He picked up his dice, he rolled it, and he got a 15. The party exclaimed triumph as the thief picked up the collar very carefully and placed it onto the ground. Afterwards, I talked to the character who plays the thief, and he said that if he had not picked up proficiency in thieves' tools, he would have failed. The party had succeeded in saving the elf from this evil priest and the bowels of the temple, and in doing so, they were able to get up to level 3. As they talked to the elves to discover what was going on in this town and why he was brought to the temple, they discovered that the elf's name was Lilywin, and he came here with his compatriot Dorian a couple weeks back. Under the invitation of the mayor, they came into the town and investigated to see what was going on and why a lot of the inhabitants were missing. They led them to the swamp where they discovered that an evil creature by the name of Explicita Defialis had captured and charmed a lot of the villagers in order to do her bidding. It seems as if she is building some sort of mechanism in the swamp. The characters, now realizing in order to save this village, they have to defeat this evil that resides in the swamp. But now they have the evil priest, so they can question him and figure out what is the next step. And that's it. That's what we did for session 3 at Morgan's Comics on Thursday nights. If you are interested in D&D, please swing by and talk to us. We would be glad to fill you in, and we have a lot of materials that we can send your way to get you started on your own D&D adventure. Tune in next week when we'll talk a little bit about what happens when they interrogate this evil priest, and eventually when they enter into the swamp. Everyone be safe out there. Bye now.